So hi everybody, welcome. Thank you so much for coming out on this chilly Saturday to hang out with us at TDC Design Incubation Collaboration. My name is DeLuna. I am a professor of graphic design at St. John's University, and I am also chairman of the not chairman of the board. I'm the board of directors of Typeface Club and chair of Design Incubation. So I'm going to do a little intro for Type Directors Club. Dan will do a little intro for Design Incubation, and then we will move into the panel. So just so everybody knows, if you haven't been here before, you are now at Type Directors Club. This is an organization that was started in 1946, really to just celebrate the power of typography. It's an international organization, so the perks of memberships are you get to meet a great community of people. We have all salons, events, workshops, panels in the space, and if you are a member, you get this great Type Directors Club annual. There are some copies over on the bookshelf. The annual is full of work from a competition. We have two competitions that run every year, the communication design competition and the type design competition. So your work is in this book, and it also goes, travels around the world on an international exhibition. And lucky you, the competition is on now. So you guys can submit communication design work, typeface design work, and it can be seen by the rest of the world. So some things that are coming up here. There is a salon on November 14th, which is Adi Stern and Veronica Burian of Type Together, Harmony and Converse, the story of Noam Text. November 19th, inserting myself into the conversation with Carl Ryan. December 3rd is results of the 2019 Font Purchasing Habits Survey with Mary Catherine Fluke. I don't know if I ever say her name right. Fluke. December 4th, Hyperlegible, Challenging Assumptions about Legibility and Accessibility. And most exciting, December 9th, the TDC Holiday Party at Poster House. So it's a cocktail reception and a tour of the two exhibitions at Poster House and a silent auction. So the tickets are $20 for members and $40 for non-members. Good reason to be a member now, because.
Can I plug?
Yes, plug. Oh,
I'm doing it.
Yes.
Scott Citron. I'm doing an InDesign tune-up class, a one-day workshop on Saturday, December 7th here. If anybody's interested, it'll be a lot of fun.
Okay. Not to be forgotten, Scott Citron's workshop. And I think that's it. I get everything, Doug, of TDC stuff?
Yes.
There's another panel in November on global typography.
There is another a panel, right? A panel that is happening at Parsons,
Yes.
which is a TDC AIGA collaboration, Type X graphic design, and it's November
21st?
November 21st at Parsons.
Something
Yeah,
like
and
that.
Ksenya is going to be. You're one of the
I'm
moderators.
that one,
Yeah. Okay, so that's another must.
I should know these answers, but.
Okay, so that's I think the TDC stuff.
Great.
So design incubation.
Great. Hi, I'm Dan Wong. I'm associate professor at the New York City College of Technology, which is a CUNY school located in downtown Brooklyn. I'm also co-founder of Design Incubation and chair, executive director of the organization. We've got a whole bunch of programming that happens. We have regular colloquia, which are basically mini conferences. People present their research in a very short amount of time, 6 minutes. The limit is 6 minutes, so you don't get bored to death. And it goes really quickly, and so you're able to absorb that information really quickly in these sessions. So the next one that we have a call out for submissions for research is going to be at Fordham University in February, I think, or March. But the deadline for submission is the end of December. So submit soon. We have just announced our Educators Awards. I think we're one of the only people who offer awards specifically focused on design educators and the research that they do. So we just announced those. We had so many great applications and entries for that we actually awarded 2 winners per category because we wanted to recognize the high quality of the work that's in addition to that, we have a regular fellowship, a 3-day writing fellowship. So for people who've been through the MFA program, in a lot of ways you learn how to do design projects, but you don't necessarily know how to write about those projects academically or otherwise. So this is a 3-day workshop, working with you to either work on a book proposal, work on articles, and or introduce you to writing, so we will facilitate having you write exhibitions or book reviews. And that this year is going to happen in June. And typically, the application for that it's over the summer, and the deadline is usually in September or October. So if you're interested in doing that, then think about applying for that over the summer. What else do we have? I think that's it. Oh, and these panel discussions. So these are panel discussions that are initiated by Liz. They've always been hosted here, and they are this crossover between educators, design educators, and also practitioners, and students. And so this is one of those situations where we're talking about the new technologies for typography, particularly on the residence. So thank you all for coming, and let's get started.
Okay, so we're first going to have our esteemed panelists introduce themselves. So we'll start with Jason. I have some accompanying slides with a little bit of their visuals just to go with these introductions.
Hi, I'm Jason Pamental. I'm from Providence, Rhode Island, and I specialize in using type on the web. I've written and spoken a lot about using variable fonts and just web typography related stuff for as long as people have allowed me to talk about it. And that's basically it.
Hi, I'm Ksenya Samarskaya. I run a small practice called Samarskaya & Partners, and I split my time between Brooklyn and Lisbon, Portugal. And I do a lot of visual communication, branding, typography, type design, and also teach the things as well. So that's
hello, thank you for coming. I'm Javier Viramontes. I'm a full-time lecturer at the University of New Haven. My focus is on typography. Did the typography program with Liz and Jesse over there. So yeah, I teach typography in many kinds of styles.
Hi, I'm Nancy Campbell, and I'm part of the design team, McCandless and Campbell. Trevor McCandless is right here. And so together we created a conceptual typography, mostly for magazines. We work on Earnshaw's and footwear across the road, magazines that go to the fashion industry. But we also do other projects as well. I teach typography at King University and also editorial design.
Can you guys hear us okay? Okay. No,
Oh,
Really?
not really.
old ears.
Yeah,
Yeah.
old ears.
These are maxed out, so like we need to speak up.
Okay.
Great.
I mean, if worse comes to worse, we can stand. Or just pick up the microphone.
The reason why we didn't pass around the microphones was because last time the microphones didn't follow the conversation, so the microphone goes off and over here, and the person over there is doing this, and then the microphone would go over there, and then this person. So Liz, you want to talk about?
Yeah, so part of the inspiration for this conference or this panel was a workshop that Jason Pamental did here in the Springs. where he was talking a lot about variable type and sort of thinking about type in different ways, working with type in different ways on the web, and I really started wondering if we are really, if I'm up to speed at all, and we're really teaching the right things in terms of how we're disseminating and teaching typography skills these days. So for me, there are a lot of unanswered questions, and that's sort of the point of this panel.
Right, and for me, I mean, we're a relatively large design program at City Tech. When we were at our height right after the 2008 crash, we were up to 1,200 students in our program, and now we're down to about 800. We're a really large program. In doing design incubation, what's become really apparent is education is really still typography print focused. And there really isn't a lot of education focusing on typesetting for the internet. And so this is, I think, hopefully will bring out some of those topics and discussions.
Okay, so our first question, which is really to all the panelists, and if there's problems hearing, we can pick up the mic. We're just trying to mic it also for the video. So, comparing how type was being used when you were in school versus how it's being used today, do you think design education has caught up? And if not, should we be teaching typography differently today than when you were in school, or how it was taught in the past? Anybody can pick it up, and we'll get to everybody.
I think the question has an assumption of kinds of things that we're supposed to do as industry members. I think the first kind of tendencies that you see with students is trying to figure out if there's a right and a wrong. And I think that's been sort of a question for all of us, I think, as novice typesetters and designers. But I think the focus of type education, especially now with multiple screens, different technologies, and it should be what is the methodology behind it, what is the correct setting. And every program where typography is taught is very different. Right? There are geographical differences, there are cohort differences, and so I feel like there is no universal answer for this. It's we have to take into account form, and so solving for that particular problem, I think, is the best way to answer that question.
Well, for me, I graduated from the School of Visual Arts pre-computer days. So it's changed tremendously. So actually, in a way, designers have become typesetters. For anyone who's been in the business for a number of years, back in the 80s, we used to send out for type. So the typesetters were the pros. So now we're teaching the students how to be typesetters, how to set the type. It's very important, all the particulars about good typography, and also developing an eye for fonts. And the challenge now is there's so many fonts, and there's so many ways that students can choose fonts that maybe aren't following fonts. So I think the difference between when I was a student and we really worked with several fonts, and now there's such an amazing selection that I think that the great challenge is training the students' eyes to see what's quality, but also what we do at King University is we give them a list of fonts when they're learning typography. These are kind of the approved fonts. These have been pre-selected, and basically stick to these, and maybe there's a guest font once in a while. I think that's helpful.
Eliminate some of the bad decisions.
Because back to, really, I mean, think about it, we don't really know about design. There's so many ways to go wrong. and one can say, well, you're experimenting, and that's all fun and that's good. And sometimes really great things come out of that. But I think that it's really training the eye because it has changed so much.
Ksenya, what's your take on it?
All sorts of takes. Well, I think trying to find one universal answer for how we should be teaching now assumes that we're now at this place and it's going to stay there and it's going to be static. And evident to me, like, in how much it's changed from a couple of years ago, or when I was studying, or whatever else. It's going to keep changing, and it's going to keep changing in ways we can't predict. So the best thing we can do is not teach any specifics, but teach a certain openness and adaptability, and how for people to do their own research, for people to do primary research, and how to look and verify and trust their judgment and trust their sense of right and wrong, and keep learning from
So
that.
teaching some formal skills, but also really teaching like agility and sort of being able to think critically, conceptually. I mean, I think we think about that right, a lot in graphic design, like it changes so much. So it's sort of, we can't really keep up. It's kind of, if we try to just keep up with technology, we're going.
Not keeping up is part of it, and it's also like if we're teaching students that, and the students are younger than us, they're actually more comfortable in the environment that is today than we are. So they grew up in screens and they grew up in what the current technology is. So there's also, I think, has to be a different dynamic or partnership in the classroom between who the teacher is and who the student, and how you come to problem solve together. Because there's a lot of our knowledge is outdated, and there's different kind of partnerships that I think could be optimal.
Thoughts?
Well, I think, when I started studying, it was sort of right at the point where I was one of the first students to be using Illustrator in graphic design. So it was, first semester it was tracing stuff, and then second semester it was doing stuff on the computer. Flash forward to now where it's completely different because the type format itself is fluid. And so there is a combination of, we have to have as much a culture of learning as educators as the students do, because if we don't keep learning, I mean, I think we do have to keep up. I don't think there's any excuse for us as educators to not come to grips with what the changes are. But then I think there's this balance and tension between understanding core concepts of hierarchy and what is good typography, quote unquote. And I say that with the quotes because what is good typography means one thing in print, it means another thing on screens, and it means something else entirely when you get into like an augmented reality situation where Ksenia has done a lot of research. I mean, that's a virtual set of type in space. I mean, there's all different kinds of considerations in what normal is. And I think this is where my workshop was sort of focusing, that kind of started our conversation, which was letting go of specifics about point-size relationships between things. Because anytime you open up InDesign or Photoshop or Illustrator, you're picking a number. And you're saying, like, this piece of type is this big, it's staying right here, I put it down, it's not going to move. And that doesn't happen on the web. Everything moves, everything changes. In a virtual reality environment, it changes even more. And so I think that there's an even a greater need for us to help decouple those things for students, so they're not so hung up on the specifics of one platform once they get into another one. And I do think that's a really big gap. I'm not teaching full-time, so I don't really want to have aspersions about like everybody's programs, because I don't know what they are, but that's what I see.
And even those rules changed over time, because not so long ago, for screens, they would say, well, you should stick with sans serifs. And now there's been this explosion of new typography, and so serif fonts, because they've been designed for screens, I think are much more acceptable in body copy and such.
And even if you think back in history, it's like they did have to transition from metal. Everything was very, very fixed. To photography, all of a sudden things were moving around. So we are sort of going from that print, pretty fixed, to variable, virtual changing. So there's some parallel even in history. So to the point that we just have to keep agile because it's just going to keep changing. So speaking of variable fonts.
Yeah, so my first question to Jason, can you briefly explain what variable fonts are for those who aren't familiar with them, with the term, and what are the most practical aspects of using variable fonts instead of traditional web fonts? Are there specific features of variable fonts that make major improvements in the design process?
This is normally something I talk about for at least an hour. But out of respect for everybody in the room, I'm going to try and keep this to like a minute. So variable font, so for those of you who aren't familiar, a variable font is...
How many people know what variable fonts are?
Okay,
So like half.
that's awesome. So it is all the variations of a typeface family contained in a single file. And that works both in print and also on the web, where if you think through something like a typeface like FF Meta that might have a width as narrow as 60% and up to 100, and then weights from 100 to 900, imagine all of that in one file so that you don't have to worry about what you're loading, especially on the web, and you can actually access all of that through CSS or through sliders and whatnot in Illustrator or now InDesign, Sketch, Photoshop. So it brings a lot greater variety to what we can do on the web especially. So there's a performance gain because it's a more efficient file. So we're loading fewer things, we're loading less data, so the user experience is improved, but then by having a whole range of width and weight, we can tailor the user experience. We can tailor things for light and dark mode. For people with low vision, we can be more expressive and do better editorial design on the web. All of those things are then available to us when we have the whole family instead of just one or two files.
Anybody else have any experience with variable fonts? Do you work with them, Ksenya?
I've played some, I haven't. I mean, it's, when you're designing type, you're designing a variable font on the back end, so there's a difference between if you're designing type, you naturally work that way. So it's more on the user.
I mean, at this point, because I just did a class in fonts for the web, and then still there's only really a handful of open source variable fonts. Like Adobe has one, Google has one, Apple has one. Like there's really just 4 that are free, and then the other ones are paid. But that makes it really difficult to work with students to try and teach them about it. Also, not all the browsers are completely supportive. They don't, depending on the version of the browser that you have, it may or may not support variable fonts. So variable fonts are very much on the cutting edge at this point.
Well, I will say it's better than it sounds. And I will couch this in the term that I am a variable font's biggest fan. I've spoken at 20 events this year all over the world about them. So I'm a little biased, but the support is there in every shipping browser. It works in Android, it works in iOS. The only place where it doesn't work on the sort of currently shipping web, for what most of us deal with, is IE11. And it's actually not that hard to code around that. You can use some CSS that says, only show the variable fonts for browsers that support it, everybody else gets a static web font. So we've actually put that in production for the state of Georgia and for a couple of other clients, and it does work really well. And there are some really good examples of open source variable fonts out there. There are the ones that you mentioned, Source Sans and Source Serif. IBM released Plex Sans as a variable font, and that's a really, really nice one. Google has been actually sponsoring the development of a whole bunch. So you can actually reach a bunch of those in a new version of their font loading API, so you can actually use a dozen or so that they have on the web. They've got another dozen or so coming.
Okay.
Recursive was just introduced from them. It's a really beautiful one. If you go to recursive.design, it's a really great little specimen site. You can kind of play around with it and get a better understanding of variable fonts.
But so really all mostly web applications.
There are a few companies doing interesting things in print. Adidas has been using their own variable fonts for almost 2 years, exclusively in print. They're not using it on the web yet at all, which is kind of amazing, but they're using it for uniform design, and they're using it for a lot of their print advertising, and they ended up writing their own custom plugin for InDesign so they can do like copy fitting using the width axis and the weight to create some of their really beautiful layouts that they've done.
Right, because the issue sort of is more the programs being able to use it in the Creative Suite, which is basically what we use.
Yeah.
Would that mean that they have to change like the Adobe print software, Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign? Would the interfaces be the same? Would you use them in the same way that you use traditional?
Yes. So support was just released for variable fonts in InDesign this week at Max. It's been in Photoshop and Illustrator for over a year. Support's a little rough. I'm not going to say that it's like really well baked, but you can pick a variable font, and then in the type palette there's going to be a little extra button that shows up, and you click on that and it shows you all the different variation axes available for that font, and then you can work with them right in your application.
Cool. Okay, our question for Ksenya. So we have learned that you're doing work in AR and VR. Does type behave differently in this environment? Are there different skills that we need to learn in order to work in these environments?
Well, there's a z-axis for one, so there's dimensionality. I tend to have a career where I enjoy playing in wide open spaces, and nascent technology is a really beautiful place to just kind of play and experiment. A lot of the AR and VR stuff was actually stuff that I was doing in collaboration with one of my grad students, where we were just playing and experimenting and trying to understand what could be in that space, and also taking stock on what's happening. When I was looking around, there aren't a lot of people with a type background that are working in those spaces, which leaves a lot of room for experimentation and doing things that people haven't fully played with yet. So it's an interesting space to watch develop. And I also think like there's so much reward in being in a technology or in an industry at the start, where you can kind of play and guide what groups develop and which way it goes. And there's a lot of potential when you add other dimensionality or time or other ways of experiencing typography.
One of the first places I saw you talk about it was at Typo Labs, and there was so there's kind of like one of the themes was like people investigating the use of type in these virtual environments, and I think one of the things that was really fascinating to me, and you just sort of touched on that, is the notion of z-axis. I mean, is the idea of physical distance in addition to the dimensionality of type. And so really thinking through, like, how do you define readability or legibility in something that exists in this virtual 3D space? And I think that was some of the most interesting stuff that we saw at that event. And it has to do with the rendering, the quality of it, but also then like kind of understanding what, we know what a good type size is in print. You know, I mean, we have these things that are like kind of normal, but when it's virtually 15 feet away from you, what point size is that? Like, I mean, like, I don't even know like, how you decide like what units you use with that. I mean, how much more did you kind of dig into that when you were?
A bit more, but that to me is like, there's so many of these things that we think are rules for what's legible or for what the right point size is, and like none of those are actual rules. This is all stuff that's done by trial and error and iteration, and by just experimenting and by immersing yourself in the final product and in the space that you're designing for. And I think it's kind of, there's value in constantly remembering that, and in constantly being like, okay, let's try this, and let's go into that space, and let's try it again. And that's kind of in all my, like I've done a lot of like type adaptation for broadcast or for low resolution print and whatever else, and or for legibility on low resolution screens, and it is something. And seeing what happens and also knowing, having kind of like a toolbox of questions to ask, or being like, okay, what is this like? Does it remind me of anything else? If we're adding dimensionality to type, where have I seen dimensional type before? Can I learn something from signage? Can I learn something from video? Can I learn something from all these other places?
So for you, like your training, your education, your formal training, your work with Typeface design prepared you to be able to explore these different spaces. Like you feel like all those skills that you learned prepared you for this place where we don't really know what's happening.
I mean, everything prepares you for everything.
But I mean, you
And
don't
there's
feel
initially-
like you're unprepared to deal with like new technologies, and clearly they weren't all there when you were studying.
Oh, I never studied type design, so.
Did you study graphic?
No, not that either.
None, so no training in.
So I studied installation art and physical computing. So I studied kind of like not knowing and how do you go into a space without knowing and still have a rigorous practice and can still answer for your work. And that kind of preps you to being open to how technology and how design and how communication changes.
That's sort of a neat place for students and professionals to be in. It's like when your whole body is involved in the process, you can kind of forgo the rules. Because the rules were set by people within very specific contexts. Like monks doing incunabula were probably hunched over. They were looking to golden proportions, and so it was a very involved process. Like we have new tools, new environments that require a very different physical existence, where we can do very different things. But somebody is going to come in and set the rules.
Well, and the rules were set with a certain type of bias. Like there was a bias for having it be in English, or there's a bias for something else, and so there's kind of always things to unpack. And then also, I think anyone that set the rules knew that they weren't their rules.
So he's going to come in and break them.
But are you prepared to sort of write a manifesto or something that can help us break the rules?
I'm prepared to tear apart manifestos, sure.
So on a more practical level, are you having to just basically take existing typography and deconstruct the technology and reconstruct it, or how exactly are you working in that area?
For me, part of the interest and advantage of working in dimensional or time-based type is the fact that I am a type designer, so I don't have to start with an existing typeface. I can really think through of what, and that's where the interest is of like what the optimal thing is, and that's a limitations I see in what's in that space right now, where people are starting with type that's meant for something else, and then it's like, oh, just extrusion or just something like that, when the options of how you build shapes or dimensionality or how you respond to it could be so much greater.
Which is kind of what has happened with typography right now, with the idea of ad hoc face and being able to design for screens and for the web.
Right.
I think has created the explosion of interest in typography.
Yeah.
So I'm anticipating, or it sounds like it, that there's going to be another crazy explosion that's going to happen once AR and VR gets more adopted.
It's definitely a fertile ground for it.
What I think is so fascinating right now is that we think about this chronology of going from metal type to photo typesetting to having the power to do digital typesetting ourselves as designers, to then moving into these sort of more and more abstracted, not real physical things, these environments. So like designing on the web, designing in like a virtual 3D environment. That's a whole lot of change in the last 15 years, 20 years at the most, where a lot of these shifts have happened. So, I mean, it's small wonder that we're struggling to catch up as educators as well as practitioners. But I do think that maybe rules isn't the right word, but figuring out norms, figuring out things that tend to be successful or ways to work with stuff. I mean, even when it comes to type selection, yes, there's a smaller number of open source ones, but there's actually dozens and dozens of really high quality, professionally done variable fonts available for use commercially. And oftentimes they have demo and trial licenses. Everybody wants to get these things out there in the market. So there actually are more and more ways for us to keep experimenting, but it requires that we kind of adjust our thinking along the way and then start to keep pushing ourselves as practitioners.
Well, a lot of these rules are, like you mentioned, like the rules exist as stopgaps for these transitional periods, like for exactly how you said, where they're supposed to use sans serif on the web, and then when you have a new range of serifaces that are designed web first and that are designed for a digital display, all of a sudden you have all these options and you can kind of remove the crutches and remove the things that were the guidelines for this kind of, transitional space.
Okay, so the next question is for Javier. You've been involved in stone carving and have taken your students to Italy to experience letterpress printing. Are you a very adept digital typeface designer? Are these activities complementary and relevant? Do traditional skills and modalities have a place in typography education, and if so, why?
Just one question. You have a minute.
Yeah, pick any one of those and please respond.
And remember all those.
Remember the list.
Well, it's a sort of a crazy question.
Can you explain something like the stone carving? I'm not sure about all these things that you're involved in.
How do they all?
Yeah, what you're doing in stone carving and what that
Well, I think
organization
that
is.
mirrors my own career. I've done advertising, graphic design, technology, robotics, now teaching. And so when you're teaching undergrads, you have to kind of step back from these kind of lofty conversations and go back to the beginning. But so they must be done in a very careful, studious way. I took my students to Italy to talk about the trade, Roman letter fonts. And so the whole objective of this month-long program was for them to learn how to use brush calligraphy, just how the Romans did it, as Father Edward Caddich proposed it. And so out of that, we also looked at letterpress printing in Typeface, which we've also done. It's an amazing place. You ever
Quite a
try?
few people here actually have been.
It's a really wondrous place. The stone carving and all these sort of craft-based things could be pursued on their own as a traditional craft. But how they apply to undergrads is so that they can sort of understand and appreciate value. Right? So I think value, and I think this was a question that Juliette Cesar answered in the previous panel for Design Incubation, was that the best way to teach about licensing, for example, was through making your own typeface, right? So I think in the students doing these very removed crafts, they do learn something about the very value of what they're touching. It's sort of from a perspective point, respecting history. And so I've always taken to this quote by a Catalan writer, Eugenio de Ors, who said, "Lo que no es tradición es plagio," which means what is not tradition is plagiarism. Meaning to say, the quote is longer, but it really means that what you have is not your own, so therefore you kind of must respect it. So this coming spring semester, based off of some of my own personal research that I did in Italy during weekends, was to take up stone carving, letter cutting. How that applies to students again is so that they can have another experience where they can learn to love typography. I personally fell in love with typography when my brother bought a calligraphy kit from Barcelona, and then my second love was letterpress printing. My third love was Type Cooper program. And I feel like I'm divorced from all them, but because I teach full time, so I don't have the time to fully do them separately. But you kind of have to have I guess the metaphor could go on, and you could say I've had children with all these loves, and so I have to have an amicable relationship She
Going right off the deep end.
Keep going.
So yeah, no, it's just these are really wonderful opportunities for students to understand the deep tradition.
And you didn't feel like you had to be an expert in any of these to share them with the students, or
Not at all. No. It comes from a place of amateurism. The same author also said that he's a specialist in general ideas. And I think I'm a victim of a liberal arts education, so that's sort of the approach that I take, and I even give my students as well.
I've used that as a tagline often. I specialize in being a generalist.
Yeah, you're never.
Okay, Nancy, we have a question for you. So, as a working professional in a time when there's so much type available out there to purchase, to use, how do you select your type? Do you stick with what you know? Do you search the web for different things? Do you just rely on Typekit, Google Fonts? What should we do? How should we learn to find type?
That is a good question. There's so many resources and so many places to go. Keeping up with typography now it's a part-time job. Well, I actually made some notes here.
She's more prepared than us.
And Trevor helped me make the notes too. So, well, generally speaking, so when we're working in the magazine world, for the body copy and the general look of the magazine, we stick with set fonts. But where we get to have a lot of fun is when we do our features. And our fashion with different typefaces, we do hand-done typography. And I think what's really changed now from when I started back, I started at Mademoiselle magazine a number of years ago, and we were doing a lot of funky, it was kind of during the kind of punk grunge era, and we were doing ripped paper, and it's kind of funny, it's coming back to that a little bit. So that was back in the 80s, and so what we do now is we take, Trevor does a lot of this actually, he'll take the type and turn it into outlines in the design, and then actually, and work it and stretch it, and become, in a way, a typographic illustrator. So we're taking set fonts that we've done a lot of research on, and some of the different, and then we actually go and modify it for our designs. But some of the places that, we keep up on typography by, we subscribe to a service called Stack, and that you get one indie magazine a month. It's a really great, if you guys don't know about this, I really do. It's a great way to keep up on what's going on trend-wise with typography. So it's called Stack, it's out of London, Stack Magazines. And every month we get a curated magazine in the mail, and we see what these indie magazines are doing. So that's kind of a fun thing to do. Also, of course, buying magazines, The Streets of New York. We also get Type magazine. Roger Black has a magazine called Type. And of course, we look on, there are countless sources of, some of the websites that are good, you guys probably know about this, is I Love Typography. That's Jonathan Bordley's website, and what's kind of cool on that is there's actually a guide to web typography on that, and it also gives like historical references, so a very simple guide to web typography on this website called I Love Typography. And then of course there's Type Wolf by Jeremiah, I think it's Shoaf. Shoaf? Yeah. You guys probably know about you guys know about Type Wolf. It's a very great resource. Then there's the Letterform Archive, that's a good resource. And then we do research new foundries and kind of keep up with that. We have one that's really good is called Future Fonts. You guys know about Future Fonts? And that's a really wonderful way to access type that's being developed, new fonts, type trends. There's also, well, of course, there's Font Bureau, Roger Black and David Berlow's font bureau, that's kind of classic. And a lot of these, they have blocks, so you can learn a lot of the blocks. But I'd say that the big challenge now is keeping up. We're pretty concept driven, so the idea of being concept driven will never change. I mean, I really love concept driven design. That's where my passion lies. How we get there, what fonts we use, and what the look is, that changes. And it's ever evolving, and it's quite exciting. I think it's a lot of fun. I mean, it's being stagnant as an artist, we don't want to be stagnant. We want to always be inspired by what's going on around us. And I think it's a time of, I think you said it's type explosion. It's a typographic explosion. And it's fantastic.
And Jason also has a book, a little plug. You have a book on responsive type.
I wrote a book called Responsive Typography, which is oddly enough still mostly relevant, even for a tech book. It's like 5 years old now. But I also write a weekly newsletter about web typography that just kind of generally covers like one technique a week-ish, explaining a little bit of history and then going into how you would do that on the web. But I also wanted to mention FontStand is another great application platform that has a really neat model where you can rent fonts really cheaply. So especially as students and young designers who want to experiment with stuff, that's another great way to tap into a new market. And I wish I could remember who said it, but just sort of addressing generally, do we have enough fonts? That sort of like perennial question. And I wish I could remember who said this recently, that's never gonna, we're never gonna have enough, because what is fascinating about type being created today is that it is created today. It's influenced today. It's of this time. And yes, there are some classic typefaces that should be in our approved lists that we go back to and we know are always going to be tried and true. But to have something that is particularly of an era of 90s grunge, of like the origins of digital design, like FF Meta or Officina from Eric Spiekerman, like they're ones that kind of were part of that evolution. That's always going to change. There's stuff that's being introduced today that is very much influenced by current design trends, and I think that's the wonderful thing about it is that yes, there will be weird little subtle differences, and we may not know what they are, but like the current trend today of like super high contrast, beautiful serif typefaces, I don't want that to go away. I love to experiment with that stuff. So, I think there's.
And the reverse contrast is very interesting too.
Anybody else want to weigh in on your type sourcing, purchasing habits, and also how you teach students to use type? Because I'm finding that challenging at this point, or to where to get it, where they get it from.
I feel like, unfortunately, I remember back in 2014, it was TypeCon, and the vice president of MyFonts was talking, and he said that the size of the font industry was a few magnitudes smaller than the ringtone industry. And that was just a really shocking fact. And we were talking about if, I think distribution was sort of the answer. The following year, FontStand came out, and now we have Adobe fonts, Sky fonts from Type. And, these can provide you with a lot of resources you didn't have before, but at the same time, you're still tied to their particular collections. So I still find myself going to specific type foundries. And then when you buy them from directly from the designers, you have this capitalist satisfaction. You can picture yourself funding the person's life. Whey protein.
That's what's so interesting about Future Fonts. Like the Future Fonts platform is basically you buying and funding the development of a typeface. And then like you might pay $50 now or $30 or whatever somebody like prices it at initially, and they might only have some uppercase letters, but eventually they finish it because more and more people do that. And I really love that very direct connection to putting money in the pocket of the person who's designing it.
But at the same time, I feel like you have other voices from, established designers where they say that's kind of not good for the market. I personally don't know, so maybe Mary Catherine will give us
Yeah,
some
when we
better
find out
answers.
on the survey, yeah.
But, it's something to think about.
Ksenya, where do you go for typefaces? Do you just draw them yourself?
Draw my own. So yeah, the more I started drawing, the less I knew of what was happening elsewhere. But no, I try to go to independent foundries, and there's foundries I like. There's Type Foundry's archive website, which lists all the foundries globally, big or small. So I try to go there as much as I can and go to. And they list it by country, so if there's a language that you need or a region you want to talk to. But yeah, it's just kind of doing research and keeping up with it, and then you get your favorites, but trying to diversify my sources and encourage my students to as well.
I mean, I think it's also interesting you brought up about manipulating typefaces. So that's the thing that we always taught our students not to do, and that seems to be a big trend now. So I think it's pretty exciting, but I don't know how type designers feel about. I mean, I guess
I'm all for it.
You're all for it. Yeah, I mean, it's really exciting to me to see.
Might be illegal.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, I think once you've created,
Sell it.
Yeah.
Or,
Is it illegal?
Well, some licenses tell you do not modify.
well, but once you've created outlines out of it, you're not modifying the fonts. So, it is worthy of discussion.
I've heard, as somebody who's published in Typeface, I really don't care,
Yeah.
but I know a lot of people, my peers kind of do.
Do we have any type designers out here who want to weigh in? It's fine.
Well, my editorial design class last year, some of the students did amazing work by manipulating the fonts and twisting them into all kinds of fun things, and I thought it was fantastic. I didn't know about the removal aspect.
I think it's happening more and more. I mean, I think the rules are just being broken. So.
I think as soon as they introduced create outlines,
Yeah.
people have been doing the same that for 25 years. I mean, that's, I don't
well,
know.
before it was with a photocopier or
Right.
some other
Right,
way.
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I have
That-
taken,
yes.
I didn't take an ed class. Has anyone here taken Ed's class at SVA? Such a great class. Trevor took it, anyway, so Ed did show how to take the type, and to alter it. He was very big into altering, to make it fit for just exactly the space that it was in, so he was very much about tweaking out the typography. And I don't think it was just fonts that he had designed, wasn't it?
Well, he would always be so echo.
Well, I mean, isn't that inherently part of
Giza.
the branding process? You take an existing typeface and then you manipulate it to make it original for that particular brand?
I think that would be part of it, yeah, to do that, to customize it.
Right.
He showed us a logo from Lincoln Center that he did, and it was Futura, and he showed us like how he had made subtle changes to the width of letters on known properties in optical compensation and type design.
I think that's one of the reasons that some people, I think some type designers are hesitant about variable fonts, is that once you get past a single weight, or a single axis rather, like weight might be really familiar, but if you have a weight axis and width and maybe then italics, there start to become corners of those design spaces that type designers themselves may not want people to use. And currently the format doesn't allow you to gate those things off. To be this heavy and this narrow and slanted is, not, it's sort of an uncomfortable little space, and the type designer may feel that they would prefer somebody not do that. And some type designers I've met have used that as an excuse to not adopt the format or explore it at all. And then you have other people like David Jonathan Ross, who is a wonderfully talented designer. Plug for Font of the Month Club.
Right, his font is up, well, it's not up there now, but your names are set in his October or September font.
So he feels that it's going to be up to the designer to make good decisions. And so he's one of the more accepting of those uncomfortable moments. But I think it can lead to some serendipity. You find some really, really beautiful things. There was one that came out that actually has an axis that goes from serif to sans serif. And I thought some of the most beautiful moments in that one, that in my own experimentation, was somewhere in the middle. And that was, I'm sure, not what the type designer really intended. But I think that's what makes this so exciting to me. And just something I didn't mention before, variable fonts do not allow for distortion. It is only allowing access to the points in the design space that the type designer intended. So it is something that I think a lot of people ask about. It's not like you're using fonts horizontal scale or something like that.
It's written into the.
It's
Right.
written into the, yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a multiple axes, so for instance, you can go from like thin to bold to black, or you can go from narrow to extended. So it's up to the designer what
Right.
the axes are
Right.
they're going to be manipulated.
Yeah.
And that's kind of why I feel like variable fonts are still rather new, because finding a whole font family, let's say, that has multiple axes that you're able to manipulate is still difficult to find.
Yeah, you see those much more commercially. Google's take on that for now, in the ones that they're introducing through the Google Fonts API, is a cautious approach. They want to introduce things with one axis to start, so that people are really just dealing with one way to change things. Commercially, you find a lot more that have both width and weight, and then sometimes slant or italic or both.
And then the other thing that's really interesting is that the technology will allow for designers to create their own axes.
Yeah.
So you can just, I don't know, what are some of the wacky ways that they're creating these weird...
There are so many, but some of the more practical ones. So the format does allow the type designer to come up with any axis they want. And so you see some that are like really crazy about drippiness or like, all kinds of things.
Spikiness. They go
Right.
from drippy to spiky.
But then some of the more practical things, just from a typesetting perspective, is the height and depth of ascenders and descenders. So if you really want to stack type tightly, being able to tuck those things up and avoid collisions is really kind of nice, and you can do it in a very subtle way. Obviously, from OK Sans, that's the one I was thinking of. That's a feature font one. That one was from Justin Kavanaugh at OK Type, and has an axis for, I think he calls it optical size, but it's basically the height of the ascenders. So when you want to like create that really cramped block of text, but you don't want it to be all caps, you can actually still get some really nice results. So there's a whole range of things that people are experimenting with.
I just wanted to note that Font of the Month Club, I forgot to mention that, that is a great, we belong to Font of the Month Club, and it's an inexpensive way to get exciting fonts. I mean, we got a font called Roslindale,
Yeah.
and that's just, we use that in the magazine, it's terrific, and it's relatively inexpensive.
It's like $6 a month when you
$6
subscribe for the year.
It's
And
fun
a
too.
little
You
bit
get
like-
a
It's like, oh,
font
what's
of the
coming
month.
this month? I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, Roslindale is on my website, it's in my slides, it's on my business card. Like, I fell in love with that like the second that it came
Instant
out.
classic, right?
So now we'd actually like to open up questions to the audience for our panelists. Two people, yes.
So, thank you for all this. It has been wonderful. One question about open variable fonts. So you have one file that is uploaded to the web. Can you target the weight of that as easily as you can when you upload web fonts?
Yes, it ties into a lot of existing CSS properties. So instead of saying, so a little bit of history. When you say font weight normal in CSS, that is an alias for 400.
Yes.
And that's actually written into the OpenType specification. Bold is 700. Google Fonts started serving Oswald as a variable font months ago. And they're doing this like 150 million times a day, and they didn't tell anybody.
No, I didn't
Because
know.
the weight, and they don't do it all the time, but but it sort of proved the point that you can take a variable font, and if it has that same weight axis that people are used to, you can just substitute it, and it's going to be a smaller file size than targeting several different weights. And then if you have a weight range of, let's say, 100 to 900, in your CSS, you can just say font weight and then any number you want in that range, and the browser will do it. And if for some reason that it doesn't load the variable font, if you're somewhere in the vicinity of 400, you're going to get normal. If you're somewhere in the vicinity of 700, you're going to get both. So the web is intended to be resilient in that way. And so the width axis is mapped to font stretch, which was an existing property, poorly named, but it's there. And font weight is the same way. Yes.
I just had a big argument with one of my students as a new teacher. Is hand lettering typography?
I think there's a problem with language as far as defining these things. I think typography strictly from the formal point refers to physical things being interchangeable. They're all letter forms. I think German has a better way of defining
because it is typography, it's not maybe not a typeface, but it is type.
But it's not a system.
But it's not a system. That's the thing.
Particular person is universal.
But does it still fall under the umbrella? What was your argument?
My student just walked in.
I was like that right here.
Okay, we'll all step aside. You all can come up here.
Is that it has to, I like that word system, it has to be a system. If it's hand lettering, it's calligraphy. That was my argument.
There's a wonderful essay by Robin Kinross, What is Typography? And he just goes through a semantic exploration.
What's his name?
Robin Kinross.
Thank you.
I feel like I'm giving that. And he talks about different languages, what they mean, where the etymology of the word comes from, all these things.
Well, you could sort of go down an endless rabbit hole with that and say, well, what about fonts that are based on handwriting?
But then
if
it
you're
is
using
a
that, then
typeface,
it's a
and it's a
system.
system.
Right. Yeah. It's a slippery slope.
So it's semantics.
Just like everything else.
Yeah.
Patricia, you have a question?
I do. So you said that we can we can do whatever we want with a type, but we got to make good decisions. That was a good one. So, but how do we get our students to know what a good decision is?
Have to make all the bad ones first.
But we only have, we really have limited time with them. So when they're coming in fresh, how do you teach what good decisions are?
I feel like you have to trust them to find their own path, and for me it's like being completely open, because I'd rather them make all the bad ones when I'm around and we can have a conversation than if I was to tell them that they can only make the good ones in my class and then they go off and make the bad ones after. And for me it's just asking a lot of questions and and to continually asking why they made that decision and pointing things out and just engaging in dialogue.
So is there a way that you would say that it's bad? I'm asking because I run into this all the time.
I think it's like anything. I make them define what their intent is and who their audience and what their goal is.
Right.
And then to me, there's not necessarily good or bad. Does it meet, is it what they wanted?
Right.
And what
So
they're
it's
setting
more
out to do,
more
or
intention
does it
than
compromise their
judgment.
mission?
Okay.
I think that's really at the heart of any aspect of design is not, it's not good or bad or pretty or ugly, it's is it effective or not. Because at the heart, like any piece of graphic design needs to communicate an idea and influence behavior. If it did that, then it was not a bad decision. And so, I think any of these things, like if you take Robert Bringhurst's book or any other textbook or whatever that's going to give people some rules to go by, that may be a perfectly fine starting point, but it's still somebody else who sat down and wrote something down and said, this is the rules. So I think what's important now when you're trying to teach students to deal with it both in print and in a digital environment is to re-examine those constructs and start to take the numbers away and talk about things in relative terms. You're talking about relative hierarchy and something that has this even color or not, or this, this size relationship to this other block of copy, we need to stop putting numbers on that and saying it has to be 36 point and 12 point. It's this much bigger so that it conveys that much greater level of importance. And so I think it's really more shifting the way we describe it to talking about what is effective, what is behind making something readable. Like, we should be thinking more about how people see and how people's brains work, and start adapting the way we present typography in that context. I think that's actually more important than.
And I would go, yeah, that and even further in terms of like how far back you go and how many assumptions you uncover, like good for who? Good for
Exactly.
the company, good for
Right.
the audience, good as a counter to something. Like there's also like within the history of typography, like one, legibility as anything is really murky, but there's also been a lot of things that counter legibility or make type illegible for a purpose and for a goal, and that's just as valid. So I think it's like really stepping back and being like, who's this for and who does this serve and who does this optimize? What assumptions are you making in terms of the person that's reading it? Do you even need to be using the medium that you're using?
I stole a diagram from an engineer I worked with, and it outlined the design process very well. It had requirements, ingest, execution, revision, and the craft was sort of a continuous loop. And I think I always ask my students to evaluate what they're saying, what they're trying to do based off of these set steps. You can plug in whatever you want, you can spend as much time. Each student will spend as much time as they need in each of these stages, but at the end of the day, it's a set process that can yield very different results.
Can you repeat those steps again?
The engineer chart.
It's requirements, ingest, execution, and then evaluation.
Thank you.
And the craft lives between execution and evaluation. Right? So you can have your own amount of, you can have your own expectation about the work is, your client will have a very different expectation. So, you can continually live in that little moment.
For me, part of it is, I show my students a lot of what I think are good examples of strong design. So every class will look at work that is successful. We have a lot of guest speakers come in and present their work and talk about the process, and that's very helpful. And I think what happens, a lot of students maybe they're trying to convey too many ideas. So it's the one big idea that tends to be the most successful. So I think a lot of times, like boiling down, what is the problem to solve? How can we effectively do that visually? And I think it is important for, certainly I'm teaching type 1 this semester, and it's teaching students the foundations of good design, hierarchy, that kind of thing. And then I do believe in breaking rules, but I think in order to break rules, you need to know what they are.
Right.
So that's kind of where I come from.
There was an interesting, I guess, my own revelation this year. I mean, a lot of the writing and teaching of web typography that I've done over the years has been very much focused on typography for reading. And so really focused in on legibility, readability, typeface selection and its use, how well does it render, all of those things. And I think there's a tremendous amount of value in exploring that and figuring out what can be successful. But I also, this year, really started to think a lot more about the typography that actually should challenge you. And maybe like the stuff that you want to read is really important, that it be easy to read, but sometimes you do need to slow somebody down. And I think that is largely lost on the web. And that's where I think there is really fertile ground to explore the typography that is intentionally obscured, that is intentionally broken or manipulated in a way that is more about conveying an idea, that is much more expressive, and that's, I think, an area that is wide open right now, at least on the web. I mean, like, nobody's really spending a lot of time on that because everybody's obsessed with systems and doing things in exactly the same way all the time, which is great for reading, but maybe it's great for reading, but it's maybe not so much about actually really getting interesting. I mean, that's really what it comes back to. I mean, there's not a lot of really interesting web design. There might be some attractive stuff, there might be some readable stuff, but it's not that much that's really super exciting.
Do you think the reason for some of that is because there's too much material on the web that's too formulaic?
As someone that studied graphic design and then also has had to build these things for 25 years, I think it's because it's hard. and we're doing it at scale.
Yeah.
And so even like the average person's blog that they put up on WordPress or Squarespace or whatever has, it's an iteration of many things. Even your posts on Instagram are an iteration of many things in the context of a system. So in order to make that actually work, design and development teams spend all of this time making something that works on a phone, works on a tablet, works on low-res screens, high-res ones, all of that stuff. So we spend all our time optimizing to make one thing work. And what I've been sort of contending a lot this year is that our WordPress now and have it work everywhere. And now we need to extend. We need to get back to thinking about variation in layout design. You know, you look at Vanity Fair, there's not one article template, there's 6 or 7 or 8. And that's what makes it interesting. There's a different cover page on every one of them. It's going to be really super expressive, and we're not there yet.
Well, there's a point in time when web was exciting, like early 2000s, it was
Right.
really
Yeah,
exciting.
I mean,
There was a lot of,
yes, but it was not sustainable. I mean, Jason Santamaria did a wonderful job art directing individual blog posts for a while, and while I have never asked him this directly, I suspect that one of the reasons he stopped doing that was because it was a lot of work every single time, and it is the pace with which new stuff comes out when you talk to any large organization, even small ones, that they don't have the time or resources to art direct and really think about design variation.
I think the
kind of
point,
beat it out with the system.
I think there's been also a major shift, because if you think back of the day when Flash websites were all the rage, the goal was to hide the navigation within the interface, and you spent time trying to discover where the content was. Whereas now we're all getting our information here, and we're getting it as we're walking across the street. And so the idea is not what it looks like, but how quickly can I find and absorb that information. I think as soon as we move away from our phones and to other devices, AR and VR, I think that may open up another modality or another way of consuming information. But right now, we're really limited to what can fit in our pocket and how quickly we need the information. And I think that has kind of stripped away a lot of the design variety that happens.
I don't know.
You agree?
Well, I don't think these are mutually exclusive. The fact that we look at things on the phone these days has little to do with what we're doing at the time. So we may just as likely be sitting on the couch watching TV as we are actually, as Luca Lucy put it, like with one eye and one thumb, like walking across the street. So the form factor, I don't want to take that as an excuse. So it's smaller, so it limits the amount of creative freedom that you might have. And you do want to have clear hierarchy, but that doesn't mean it has to be boring. It doesn't mean that we can't do more interesting things. I don't want to let us off the hook.
Okay, yeah, I would agree. Definitely.
I would agree with you.
Yeah. But then you think about the business person and their end purpose, and then, you know.
Well, okay, so, but let's push that. So if everybody has exactly the same look, where are you going to decide to go to get your news? If the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, they all have exactly the same design, there's hardly any differentiation. What if somebody actually spent a little bit? I mean, anybody in the web industry knows what you're talking about when you say, well, what about the snowfall piece? And that was something the New York Times did that was really beautiful, really interactive. It was just as interesting on a phone as it was on large screen. Like, they did a really beautiful job of art directing that and designing that piece of content. And I think that we can do more of that. I think the tools are there. I think if we had the will as a team, you would then also have a competitive advantage, because and it's the same thing that was true when web fonts first came around. As soon as you used something else for your body copy, you instantly stood out from every other website that used Arial. So, I mean, we know that type has a voice. We could use it better, and I think it actually would satisfy a competitive advantage.
I feel like this time, December, is one of the most exciting ones. Not because of the gifts or anything, but it's the gifts that were given online. Because it's like every team, like Litmus with their email design, every team put emphasis on what they're going to put out there in those email campaigns or in their website. It's like they got 3 months to say, let's do this, let's be completely different. And it's just, that time of the year is amazing. Like, I really like it because of that. It pushes the limits. Like, for example, one email that really was, they put the Twitter feed in the email, active and live. And it was just like out of this world. I mean, it worked. But it was because it was a campaign that had a purpose. They wanted to be totally different from the mountains of emails you're going to receive in December or in November. You know what I mean? So it's those times that you're like, oh, this works. We can, make it
Well, an interesting discovery, and I don't want to keep monopolizing this, but somebody asked me if variable fonts would work in email, and they actually do. So not in that many email clients, but in Apple Mail and iOS, which is actually a pretty big percentage of mobile email use is actually going to be through that application. They work. They work really well. It's kind of amazing. So I mean, there's definitely opportunity.
Well, Jason, I love your point. I love the point that because there is a lot of similarity and a lot of websites, and that to do something different is to really stand out now. It's a great opportunity, and hopefully there will be more change as we move forward. Because I think there's a lot of bold headlines, center bold body copy, center bold body copy. There's a lot of repetition, so maybe that's the wave of the future. Certainly, I think there's a great opportunity there.
Seems like a good note to end on. Unless anybody else has questions. What? We got questions.
Hi everybody, my name is Javier. I'm actually a Kane student. And we had a great discussion, apart from all the other ones, but I was really interested when you said that good typography depends on the platform that you actually use it in. So how do I, as a student, get used to all these platforms to make actual
Oh my
It really depends on the scope of the class, but it's something that it should be iterated in the entire curriculum, I think. And that's something we've been trying to accomplish. Like, how do we overlap and yet, say different things? But I always think that, again, it goes back to what you're trying to accomplish. Like, a single poster is going to live as a poster, and that's it. But if you're trying to design a campaign, a magazine in different formats, you just have to plan it out, right? That's where that engineering diagram comes to mind, is you have to kind of understand what your requirements are and then design for it. Does it take a lot of time? Of course, but it's just the reality of it.
Well, I think it's about getting used to what is the material that you're working with, whether it's cutting stone or working with letterpress, where you have fixed sizes of type that you're working with, or on the web, there's different materiality there. And on the web, it's web fonts and it's some code. And so I really have been a very strong advocate for designers to learn a little bit about how that works, because we spend a ton of time learning how to use InDesign and learning how to use Photoshop and Illustrator and printing stuff out that happens to be on a 4-color printer. So there is a bit of an inbuilt bias in learning graphic design because we print it out on our inkjet printer and stick it on the wall, and we look at it, print it on a piece of paper, even when we're designing screens. So we have to actually start to adopt that in the way we teach design, that the only way you can really understand type on the web is to put some type on the web. And it's not going to look the same when you look at it in any graphics application. It doesn't matter what application it is. So we were having this conversation earlier, and one of the things that I've tried to do in my workshops is give people stuff to work with, so you don't have to do it from scratch. But it allows you to react to something rather than have to learn it all from the very beginning. But I think, to your point, to start to understand what is successful, you actually have to see it in that medium. And I think as a student, your career opportunities will explode if you can be pretty facile both in print design as well as an understanding of how the web works. It's going to open up a lot of opportunities for you. It makes you pretty unique. I can guarantee you that as someone who's been trying to hire those designers for 20 years.
And it's a continual learning process. Like I was watching one of your talks and I realized that VWs, they're not good for accessibility. You're always learning.
That's a really good point, because learning, I always tell my students, when you leave school, you have it's a lifelong commitment to learning. You have to keep learning. A lot of it is teaching yourself, actually. There's a certain amount of things that can be taught in the classroom. You have a finite amount of hours. But exploring things on your own, trying things on your own, working in the different various, if you want to do some web or whatever, do it. There's so many tutorials online that you can teach yourself. I think it's very helpful to kind of embrace the whole idea of just a lifetime of learning and keep going on that. And that's the kind of person I want to hire. I want to hire someone who's thirsty for knowledge.
I mean, I think it comes right back to your question about teaching somebody what the rules are. It's not so much teaching somebody what the rules are, it's teaching them how to figure them out. What are the rules that work for you? What is successful in your projects? And curiosity is, as for me too, has been the #1 trait that I look for in anybody I'm going to hire is what are you going to learn tomorrow that you don't know today? Because we're presented with challenges like that every single day.
I have a good story about that, actually. So when I was I hired Trevor 13 years ago. We've been working together for a while, and so he was interviewing for the job as associate art director, and he got a project to do. But there was a talk. The Type Directors Club was having a talk that night that I went to, and it was the New York Times, and it was Janet Froelich, right? It was in the old office. And I went to it, and Trevor was there. I thought, that's a good sign. I like the fact that he went to the type talk, even though he had the project due in the morning.
Well, so she liked it, and she was questioning it at the same time.
Well, yeah, because then you told me you were up till 3 in the morning working on the project. I said, that's fantastic. The kind of person I would want to hire. Someone who's always seeking knowledge and putting the extra effort in. And then the work was good, of course.
Thomas, did you have a question earlier?
Oh, no, that was the answer.
Otherwise, okay.
Good.
I've got an obscure question. So I work in packaging design, and recently I was working on a kids' juice water product at Safe One, and the brand mark was in cursive because it was all about connectivity and expressive, that kind of nature. And it came back from the client and research that they don't teach cursive handwriting in America anymore, but in Australia they do. So my question to you guys is, do you guys think that's a dying art form in typography, or do you think it'll come back one day?
That's a great one.
But it's kind of, calligraphy has come back lately. And I think it's, one reason is because we don't learn handwriting. And so it's something that's new. That's my take.
But will it be taught in elementary school as a means of communication?
It's not taught anymore.
It's not.
Cursive handwriting really isn't taught
Yeah.
anymore.
It hasn't been for 20 years.
But it's, people still see it, and I think that they still learn to recognize the forms. I mean, I think there's lots of forms of calligraphy that haven't been taught in a long time, and we can still look at it and read it. Well, I think it's a shame that it's not being taught, but I don't think it necessarily is an indicator that we'll stop being able to use it.
At the same time, we all learned it, and I've got to say my handwriting is really crappy. So I don't know about you guys.
I mean, I worked at a handwriting robotics company where we were digitizing people's handwritings on demand, and you could tell like where they're from really was a result of their handwriting or but I personally think that all these things always live. It's just they become in vogue and then they go away. You know, we still have letterpress printing, we still have letter cutting. So they just don't really go away.
Well, I went to grammar school, I went to Catholic school, and the nuns were still teaching me then. So being part of the curriculum was doing cursive writing, pages and pages of A's and A's and B's and B's. Interesting thing, I do a lot of calligraphy now. I do a lot of this handout. There's one piece up here, For Your Love, when it comes up. So we were doing a presentation to a college. I forget what piece it was. And I had done this kind of loose, sloppy handwriting. Perfectly legible though. But one of the students had no idea what it said. Because they didn't know what cursive writing was. And it was like, wow, that's crazy. There might be a time where actually people will look at it and not really know what it says anymore. Although there is a trend, you know, it's funny because there are these, there's a trend toward the hand-done but typefaces.
Like underwear type.
Yeah, I'm not like a huge fan of that myself, but I do know that some
But
people
there is a
like
lot
that.
of
There's a
hand-drawn
lot of that.
type
So
in
There's
it is
enough of it
cursive,
that Jess
right?
McCarty has a whole foundry that's dedicated to it,
Yeah.
and that's all she puts out are script typefaces that are
Right.
hand drawn, and they're really beautiful. So I mean, clearly there's still a demand.
Remains to be seen, right?
All right, now this is really gotten to the end. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience. If you have more questions for the panelists, they'll probably be happy to answer them.
Thanks, everyone.
Sure.
And
And there's water and cheese sticks at the back.
And Scott, I'm so sorry for not introducing you. I didn't look at the workshop. Yeah, but thank you for, I haven't done like a intro.